Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Happy May Day. Thank you for taking the time to be here for Prism's No More Bad News Tools for Critical Media Literacy during the election season. My name is Lara Witt. I am based just outside of Philadelphia. My pronouns are she, they. I am the editor-in-chief here at Prism, new editor-in-chief here at Prism. Super excited to be here today with all these folks in the room. This is such an essential conversation. While we were conceiving the idea for this panel, we really wanted to equip you with media literacy tools during the election year. And the movements we have been witness to and a part of over the last 6 months and beyond that have clearly shown us just how essential media literacy is and will continue to be. No More Bad News is here because this election season or this election year really feels eerily similar and to the exceptionally painful 2020 presidential election. The same two candidates, their campaigns, and by extension, mainstream media are forcing voters into this weird, impossible moral battle of deciding between the lesser of two evils. In the last 4 years, voters have seen very little change. In fact, things have arguably gotten more disastrous and much worse. There is a genocide in Palestine enacted by Israel with the US's backing, as well as other Western powers. Human rights violations against migrants, a climate collapse, a complete breakdown of public health and COVID mitigation, an extreme repression of abortion and reproductive justice. All the bad news has coincided with mass layoffs across media and other industries and shuttering the news outlets that should uphold our democracy. Prism social media editor Cuban Kim writes in Slow Readings, a critical media syllabus for the radical mind, the way people read must outsmart the ways that press produces, frames, and circulates information. So today we'd like to be able to answer some of the following questions. What underlying biases in traffic driving headlines manufacture the perspectives that we develop? How should we read the news in this media-saturated age so that we pause and disavow rather than consent to political structures that suppress and pacify us? And how can we sync our learnings to the movements we become a part of? I'm so excited to be in this conversation with our panelists today to build on the questions that are posed in the Slow Reading series. I'd love for each of you here to introduce yourselves, your names, pronouns, what you do, where you're based before we get started. And toward the end, we're going to leave time for an audience Q&A. So be sure to leave your questions in the Q&A feature or in the chat, and I will kick it off to Aisha to start.
Thank you for having me, Laura. My name is Aisha Khan. I'm the Deputy Managing Editor at Analyst News, a new nonprofit media outlet covering global injustices and social issues. I'm also the Managing Editor at Next City, a nonprofit news organization covering urban policy with a solutions-based approach and a social justice lens. I'm from Baltimore, currently in Canada on Treaty 6 territory.
Thank you so much. Maya?
Hey, I'm Maya Shenwar. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Truth Out Center for Grassroots Journalism and the board president at Truth Out. Previous to that, I was editor-in-chief at Truth Out for over 13 years. Before that, I was a reporter and helped organize the Truth Out Union. So I've worn many hats here. And I've written for a bunch of other publications and written and edited several books about the prison industrial complex, also for movement presses. So I've been active in movement journalism spaces for a long time, really passionate about this conversation we're going to have today. I'm in Chicago, which is on the unceded land of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, along with dozens of other tribes. And these lands were colonized through acts of genocide and forced removal and dispossession, and also through lies and colonizing narrative appropriation, all of which tie in with what we're discussing today as we talk about media. So I'm so glad to be here with all of you for this discussion.
Thank you so much. Joshua?
Hi. Yeah, really good to be here today. Joshua, either one. He, him. I work for More Perfect Union and the Slow Factory, and I tweet a lot myself and write a newsletter. I'm based primarily in New York, Lenape-Hoking, and I'm also from Baltimore, and also a CWA News Guild member. So happy May Day, everybody.
Happy May Day indeed. Thank you so much for those intros. I have a few everyone, anyone questions, and then some more specific questions. I'm going to start off with an everyone, anyone question. So by our very nature, Prism's work fills information gaps left by mainstream media sources, while mainstream media leaves out communities of color or demands that we uphold racist, cis hetero patriarchal ideas under the guise of objectivity. Prism puts journalism in the hands of those who have been left out of the traditional media landscape. Our rigorous journalism dispels the myth that BIPOC-led reporting is niche or that a bias is inherently bad when it questions power structures. This being said, I thought it would be a good place to talk about the three different terms to get us started: political propaganda, news, and movement journalism. I'd like to define these terms, why some political propaganda is a good necessary thing. But why don't we just get started with the definitions? And I will kick it over to whoever feels most called to this question at the moment.
I'll kick it off. I was thinking about this question just in one way, and there's multiple ways to think about it. So I'm sure everybody else will have interesting definitions. I was thinking about how political propaganda, never pretends to be unbiased. Well, sometimes pretends to be unbiased, but to the thoughtful, considerate reader or observer, the bias is made very clear. And then I was thinking about how news feigns this objectivity. Traditionally, news feigns this objectivity, while, as we are, it's such a time to have this panel. As we were seeing last night and this morning and this afternoon, news's bias comes from the halls of power and often frames official statements or police statements as objective statements, when those gathered here know those statements are anything but. And then how movement journalism, I think I'm really glad that we're talking about this, especially with Prism, who does it extremely well, doesn't seek to obscure the facts in the way that propaganda sometimes does, and which, again, is not always a bad thing. There are some facts that ought to be focused on more at certain times. But how movement journalism eschews the fake objectivity of the news and instead goes deeper into the truth. And the truth often has an anti-power bias or an anti-halls of power bias. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I'm here with people who know more than me about this, but I think there's some interesting stuff to tease out with political propaganda and movement journalism, and how movement journalism, to me, can embrace the range of facts and still wind up painting an extremely clear picture of the truth, much clearer than mainstream media, news, whatever we like to call it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I would also add, I think all three of these things have an important place and a role in a healthy functioning democracy. The most important thing is that all of us as readers and the public can really discern between them. I think that's the crucial point. How I would define movement journalism is, as Press On does, is journalism in service of liberation, in service of the public good. Again, not hiding behind objectivity, very open about the underlying commitment of the journalist producing it to human rights, to social welfare, to supporting vulnerable and oppressed people, and supporting the work of these vulnerable and oppressed people. Another crucial point within that is that it, as much to the extent possible, eschews media gatekeepers and official narratives. It's not advocacy journalism in the sense that it is producing evidence-based reporting that is pushing for changing the status quo. But I think The difference between them is in the relationship to the media gatekeepers and the official narratives. Political propaganda is coming from, these state-sanctioned narratives, and literally it's the party line, right? News tries to, or makes some, effort to be more balanced and objective, but it's very much informed by that official narrative and the media gatekeeping. Movement journalism tries to look at it with a very critical lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with all of that. And I like this idea of recognizing the importance in all of these arenas, that it's not like we do movement journalism and that's all there is. Like, propaganda obviously has a role in movements. We need political groups to be putting out their messaging in a catchy way. We need slogans. We need theater and art and pop culture as part of movements. And it's not the same as journalism, but it's this essential thing. And then I think when we look at movement journalism, at least at Truth Out, as we've kind of thought through, what do we do? What's the point? I think part of it is recognizing journalism as action. So recognizing that words do things in the world. And that's true whether we like it or not, whether we're intentional about it or not. And as movement journalists, we're embracing that fact and thinking intentionally about what we want our journalism to do. And part of this has to do with uplifting the work of organizers, interviewing them, covering their work, providing opportunities for them to write their own stories, thinking about journalism in expansive terms. So you don't have to go to grad school to write a story that is worthy of being considered movement journalism. In fact, you might do that better if you have not attended an elite journalism grad school. So there's that. And then I think this also relates to the question of who we're accountable to as movement journalists. We want to be accountable to movements for social justice, organizers, mobilizers, marginalized communities. And we can talk a lot about questions like which movements, which communities, particularly when various communities are in conflict. But this sense that we're accountable to those struggling for liberation, I think, is a core part of what defines our work. And I think I'll just say one tiny final thing on this, is that I think movement journalism also has an oppositional role. It's necessarily in opposition to some of the things that corporate media is doing, because they're taking action too. And a lot of that action is harmful. And they're doing it through this false veneer of objectivity. And so I think this recognition that some media is really actively doing harm, including some corporate liberal media, I think informs our work as movement journalists and helps us make decisions intentionally and think about principles of do no harm ourselves and what kind of actions we're taking ourselves.
Thank you so much. All of these responses just make me think of last night when the NYPD raided the Columbia campus to clear out the hall and the encampment itself, and how the student journalists at, I think it's WKCR, were in this position where you could hear them so scared, so driven, and so shocked by this moment that their campus leaders could do this to them without any warning, and that they had to, shed just dispatches or just share these dispatches while they were also being attacked and shuffled from one place to another. as they were watching their colleagues and other fellow students be harmed by police, removed from campus, threatened, and how they kept trying to split between like, we're journalists and we're sharing these things, but then they're also experiencing the trauma of what was happening. And so they are the best positioned to share their stories. They were the best positioned to share their dispatches because they were experiencing the thing. They were on campus. They know the campus well. They know these people well. And I keep thinking about that in relation to what we all do here, especially what we have done as journalists, as storytellers, is recognizing that we can lend a certain amount of authenticity or ultimate authenticity to our stories because we know who to go to. We're not going to share a story that our readers are going to read and be like, you don't know what you're talking about. We do know exactly what we're talking about. And I think that that's really one of the most crucial elements of movement journalism and what each of us does in our roles. This being said, I think it's a good time to segue into the next question, which is, what are the tools the state uses to enlist media into becoming propaganda machines? Some things to think about is like little offshoot questions is how the ruling classes control media narratives and why does it matter? As well as police corroboration or media corroboration with police or elected officials. Who would like to take this question first?
I can talk about some of these things. I mean, first of all, I think if we look at the industry and the media landscape as a whole, we have to recognize like a number of things that we're seeing. For number one, public trust in the media at an all-time low. Just that is what it is. Number two, local news, it's been destroyed. It's not just that it's dead, it's actively been destroyed with devastating consequences for our democracy and our overall literacy and civic engagement and all these things. Not unrelated, we're seeing hedge funds buying up and sinking news outlets left and right. Again, not unrelated, we're seeing unlivable wages in this industry. We're seeing mass layoffs. Meanwhile, the internet is, just a wellspring of conspiracy theories and disinformation. The source of a lot of these dysfunctions is twofold, I would argue. Number one, obviously we have the class composition of the media. This isn't news to any of you. Number two, the fact that the media is by and large a capitalist enterprise operating under capitalist logics. It's being driven by viewer and reader retention. That's the goal. Another goal is, creating more opportunities for advertisers and sponsorships and just advancing the number of views that each of these advertisers gains on their platforms, right? You might say that, the press has always been like a captured institution in that sense, right? Which is probably true, right? It's always been an instrument for the political elite and the ruling classes. Maybe you might argue this should have gotten better, in this sort of digital era where anyone can reach an audience online. But the era of corporate media and media consolidation, especially like just the narrowing of this industry, right? Who owns all these different broadcast news stations? It's like 3 hedge funds, right? So that has an impact, right? The institutionalization of this field through things like prestige-based journalism schools where you pay like $60K a year, and that's your entry point into this industry. Even things like standardization, like the AP style book, right? Which literally, like I went to journalism school for undergrad. We were taught from day one, this is your Bible. This is your Bible. Memorize this, right? And many journalists, perhaps even most journalists who work for corporate media, will not step out of that line, right? If you suggest that, for example, even something as small as maybe let's capitalize the B in Black, right? Or remove the hyphen in Asian American, you will be, derided as a radical until the AP eventually decides that we're going to make that shift. And then everyone makes that shift and falls into line. So things like that, we can see how that controls a lot of the language that we're seeing around the terminology that's being used to describe Palestine as the Palestinian territories and different things like that, right? So I really think everyone should be thinking about all these things that are happening in the background that we may not consider as we're reading a news article, but they're playing a crucial role there.
Absolutely. I think I think those elements are really, really important. And they also point to what we can be doing as movement journalists, in addition to kind of like the big picture stuff, creating our own style guides. You know, at Truth Out, our style guide, like when we first started our style guide, we were like, here's this thing off in the corner. And now it's like this central living document that is contested, that we constantly have to update. And that's good, you know, because its style is so deeply engaged with politics and with lived experience. And I think the question of funding too, this hedge fund ownership and this large corporate ownership more broadly, that's actively determining what gets covered, who gets interviewed, who's covering it, who's hired, who's fired, all of those things. And then as movement journalists, we think about like, okay, how are we going to fund ourselves in ways that aren't determined by that, even like if those powerful moneyed forces call themselves left or progressive, you know, how are we going to do that? Part of that, I think, is figuring out reader-driven funding models. We can talk more about that later. But another thing in thinking about how ruling classes control media narratives, I think, Laura, you spoke to some of this with just recognizing the police as a force that controls media, like physically, like with their concrete actions. And I think right now, recognizing police repression of media, which is very intricately connected with military repression of media. And of course, we see this in Palestine as an issue of mass murder. That is, I think, central to this question of how media is controlled. And I think about that also in the sense of like, what does it mean to do journalism covering the police or covering the military, covering violence in our society? I'm thinking back to some of the guiding questions for me in thinking about why movement journalism was necessary years ago. And one of them was this issue of embedded journalists. And that kind of terminology evolved during the war in Iraq, when hundreds of journalists were embedded with military units. And that was just considered, well, that's how you report on war correspondents who are actually embedded with military units and dependent on them. And at Truth Out, then we had to think about, okay, like, how are we going to do unembedded reporting? And our reporter, Dar Jamil, actually went unembedded into Iraq to do that reporting. And it became this question of like, what does it mean to do journalism on the questions that are most actively violent in our society? And part of that is like not participating in the violence if you're covering it. One tiny little additional story on that. So 20 years ago, I was interning with In These Times magazine, and I noticed that in Chicago, the Department of Homeland Security was conducting a training for journalists. And they were going to train journalists on emergency response. And I was fascinated by this. And I went to the training, you know, I signed up for the training. And it was so horrifying because basically they were teaching journalists, who were all very eager, they were all from mainstream outlets, how to respond to crises, and talking about these as cases in which the state and media were supposed to work together, that was the responsibility of media, was to participate in these defined ways. And some of them included like dying if the choice was, you know, for you to die or the president's daughter to die. There were all these like ethical questions. And it really made me think about like, even when DHS is not explicitly holding a training, I don't know if they still do that, even when they're not explicitly holding a training, they are using scoops. They are using access to congressional spokespeople. They're using all these relationships and all these like little ways of exerting power to actually determine narratives and determine who tells which stories. So it's something to think about, I think, also as we read the news.
I don't have much to add to all that. I mean, I was thinking about the access element as well. In New York, we see it with, NYPD most notably, but, Adams administration or whoever it may be. Last night, a mainstream reporter and probably other outlets ran with the story of the wife of a terrorist being at Columbia University, and the source was an unnamed Adams administration, staffer source. The initial tweet that I believe set it all off has now been deleted, and so it goes. I mean, Eric Adams is, that administration is like a caricature of a lot of what we talk about with access and sort of manipulative nature that of those relationships at times. But those manipulative or sometimes dishonest relationships are also enabled, of course, by like the ownership class of the publications, as has already been talked about. It wouldn't fly if the people in those positions weren't okay with it. If there was a rapid meting out of consequences for such, pay-to-play relationships and stuff like that, it'd be a different story. But it's not. And the only other thing I'd add is, I think Aisha started talking about some of the ownership stuff, and then how the internet, there was this glimpse of democratization and, decentralization of journalism in a way that could be helpful or liberatory or, help movements. And I still think there's a degree of that, but, one of the ways that the ruling class continues its control over a lot of journalism is that democratic internet has been consolidated into like 5 websites. It's not, maybe not literally, but Meta, Google, Twitter. How much of the news is run or controlled through those 3 companies, or access to the news, or Google and Meta not paying journalistic institutions for the sort of blurbs and the snippets of news they basically get for free from these from all media organizations. And then when legislation is passed fighting that, then they fight the bills and so on and so forth. So, tying it back to movement journalism for me is I know it's present here in this space, but just a cognizance of who we're up against, and a lot of it being these corporate interests. Yeah.
Thank you, all 3 of you, for those very clear answers. I barely have anything to add to that. You've basically covered it all. I'm going to go into some more specific questions for each of you based off of your roles and your experience. Maya, I'm going to start with you. How does Truth Out determine what to cover, who should be covering it, which other publications to uplift, and how to produce journalism that people should be reading?
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think that part of it comes back to this question that I raised earlier of what's the point? Like, what are we trying to do in the world? If we agree that the point of journalism is not just like news for itself or some sort of amorphous idea of the 4th estate, that like this is democracy, like if you do it, you are doing something good, then what's the point and what impact are we hoping to have? So for us, that falls into a few different categories. And one of them is covering breaking and timely news through a movement journalism framework. So we didn't always really do this, but we got into it because, especially as a lot of these outlets were crumbling, we saw that a lot of the timely news is just coming from AP, Reuters, like these wire services that are almost never quoting activists or uplifting movement work and bringing those into stories about the breaking news. So that's one thing that we've increasingly committed to. Another aspect of what we're doing is publishing investigative reporting, other original reporting, and op-eds by organizers and experts. And that's kind of this critical piece of our movement journalism work. And in making decisions about what to cover there, we're really looking at how we can cover current systemic injustices that are not getting enough attention, as well as those that are part of current movement moments. So in some ways that means like going against the algorithm, even as we still have to play with the algorithm, we still have to get traffic, but we try to balance this mission-driven focus of covering things that actually are not at the top of most of the headlines, at the same time as thinking about what the movement moment is that everybody's paying attention to. So of course, right now, we're actively covering the genocide that Israel is perpetrating against Palestinians and the global resistance movement. But years ago, when we launched our series, Struggle and Solidarity, Writing Toward Palestinian Liberation, this was actually one of our lowest traffic topics. Like, it was something that we would publish and we would have to push it out there so hard via our newsletter and social media just to get people to start clicking. And that was the reason why, in addition to the fact that the issue is so important, that was the reason why we were like, we're needing to do this, is because it's not the thing that's being the most uplifted on social media, and it's such a crucial issue. So thinking about that, also, we've been covering the prison industrial complex and policing and abolition in depth for 15 years. And this was well before this became something that was top of mind for many people on the left. In fact, for a lot of people, they were like, why are you doing so much stuff on prisons? Like, we had particularly donors who were like, this is interesting that you're doing so much on this. But we felt like left media is really the place where that needs to be uplifted. Like, you need to do that work, not only to uplift movements and to actually make change, but also to catapult those issues into the mainstream so that they finally start covering it, right? It was like 15 years later, oh, prisons exist. Police are not always perfect, like we started getting a little bit of that in the mainstream. So that's another thing. And thinking about underreported stories, also not letting stories die after they fall off kind of like the trending topic list. So one example I'm thinking about from this past week, our reporter Mike Ludwig did an investigative piece about the ongoing lead crisis in Flint, like 10 years after that kind of like first rose to the top of the national news, and drawing on long-standing relationships with organizers and sources in that realm to report on ongoing contamination issues, including in places that just have not been covered in national news. That's an example. Another recent example, our Victoria Law, our longtime investigative reporter, has done a bunch of recent investigations into systemic sexual abuse in US prisons and how people who speak out are facing retaliation. And, we're not in the middle of Me Too, and we're not in the middle of defund the police. So we knew going in, like, these stories are not necessarily gonna go viral or whatever, but that this is part of our mission, and also pushing them out is part of our mission. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, and I keep thinking about how it doesn't necessarily matter if people don't want to read it. We have to report on it anyways. It's our responsibility. And we're creating a historical record. It feels like something incredibly necessary to do. And then when it does come into the main conversation, or becomes like a part of the discourse, you then have a wealth of knowledge and pieces to recapture that, to share all this context that is incredibly necessary for fresh reporting. So it's never a waste of time if any donor ever questions that sort of shit, which they can and do. It's just it's deeply necessary, and we have to follow our gut when it comes to these things. Next up, I'd like to ask Aisha. Analyst News launched last year. Can you tell us a little bit about Analyst Nature and why it's so necessary right now?
Yeah, so we launched just over a year ago with the aim of cutting through the tribalism, the double standards that we see in mainstream Western media, in corporate media. We wanted to be covering the stories that are ignored because they're taboo. We wanted to be covering the stories that are sidelined because they're not serving the prevailing narratives and special interests. We wanted to highlight the sort of artificial binaries that we see being put forward, the doublespeak, the hypocrisies that we see in our politics, and the media sort of dissemination and replication of those things. So our aim was to do that by ignoring the breaking news cycle, essentially, ignoring the feeding frenzy over traffic, over ad dollars, completely sidestepping the nonprofit industrial complex with all the string attached grants and things like that. Instead, we just focused on producing slowly, of course, then thoughtful, clear-eyed journalism, critical analysis of current events on our own time, right? Our North Star is essentially helping advance a standard of what we are calling absolute justice, in which people are willing to set aside, and we as journalists are willing to set aside our own personal interests, our national interests, our tribal interests for the public good. That's kind of the aim that we try to uphold our own journalism to, and we try to uphold every politician, every ideology, every policy, everything we cover to that same standard. So we thought that a lot of the work we would be doing would be exposing those hypocrisies and double standards when we started March a year ago, sort of pointing out the absolute dereliction of duty by Western media and opening people's eyes to that and feeding people their vegetables like you're talking about. But we've really found that, I mean, obviously post October 7th, everything changed. And we found that the scales have really fallen from many people's eyes, way more than we expected. And so an audience kind of found us through that. So a lot of our coverage has been around what's happening in Gaza. And I think the appetite for this form of journalism is pretty clear. The question in my mind is, are people willing and able to expand this growing media literacy and this interest in critical analysis and movement journalism beyond this genocide, right? Are they only going to be thoughtful news consumers when it comes to what's happening in Gaza beyond the issue of Palestine? That's our next challenge, I think, even as we continue to focus our reporting on that right now.
Yeah, agreed. It's something that I've been keeping top of mind as we move through these moments. During a rant after work yesterday, I usually do this during my walks. I was thinking about how different movements over the last decade have happened in such quick succession that we're at this time now where we see how every uprising, every single movement that in the last decade has led to this moment, and we've learned from them so quickly because they happened together or so closely together. And we're watching, for example, students tell each other or share information about different tactics for protest. And not just that, but fully cognizant of the fact that a politician could come in and try to co-opt the moment in the same way that happened during the Black Lives Matter movement. It's so easy to come in with a capitalist politician to just say yes, we're going to fix this, there's going to be some reforms, don't worry about it. And then just water it down and shatter it from within. And because we're learning so quickly from each other, my rant was that Palestine is indeed everything. All of our things are tied into this moment. And once Palestine is free, how do we keep people's attention on the myriad other issues that are connected to it, from the prison industrial complex to imperialism to capitalism? How do we move forward from this moment? And how engaged are people going to be? How hungry for news sources like ours are they going to be looking for it? And so that was my rant. And I'm happy I was able to share it here today because it just feels very timely. And I'm going to lead into my next question for Josh. How does your work as an organizer interact with media literacy? And what do you see as most important while organizing when it comes to media literacy?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Aisha's point and your rant led into that. I think since October, it's been clearer and clearer to many people, like was just said, that we have been propagandized, and that the occupation and apartheid state and genocide in Palestine are so interconnected to so many other things. Right now, college students are showing how there's mass investment from supposedly educational institutions in the military industrial complex, in imperialism, in war manufacturing, all these things. And I think that would not have happened, like you just said, Laura. That would not have happened without these waves of uprising and organizing that followed them. 2020 in particular, but other moments from 2014 and college, other divestment campaigns, environmental related or otherwise. But I think in terms of organizing and movement journalism, I think that what happens often in street movements or protest movements, is that people on the ground get so caught up in the moment. That moment feels like everything. My first organizing was an encampment, student environmental divestment encampment 10 years ago, and that 2 weeks feels like 2 years in my mind. It's just like you're in a tent, so you're not sleeping a lot, and that it doesn't help. But it can be really hard to take a step back. I think 2020 was another example where that summer it was difficult for people to take a step back. When the police attack you one night, you want to go out again the next night, and 10 other people often want to come out again the next night and keep going and pushing. And it's true that there is a rare sort of possibility present in these moments sometimes. But I think movement journalism and the conversations that people can have when they're more informed and when they have been given the tools and the information to better zoom out a little bit from that moment, I think that can really change movements and help organizers and help people on the ground. Just to wrap up, what it's making me think of is how in around September 2020 or so in New York, the crowds really shrank. The 10,000 people that were there every day in July were no longer present in the streets. And we were getting, NYPD was much more liberal with their assaults with smaller crowds. And into that fall, people just started stepping back. And, what are we doing? What are we doing here? And then by the spring of 2021, what you saw is like dozens of new mutual aid groups, new community organizing groups, the people who wanted to stay committed found new ways, and they found more sustainable ways. And I think for me, personally, and for tons of people, we're reading Mutual Aid by Dean Spade, or we're reading books by, Mary McCalloway, Kelly Hayes, articles in Truth Out, whatever it might be, Prism. That winter was a lot of that regrouping, and I think movement journalism and writing in that vein helped us out a lot.
Yeah, I love that. And it makes me think about how movement journalism, when we do it in this intentional way, it can be part of the antidote to burnout. And that movements do come in these seasons. And Miriam and Kelly talk about this in their book, and been said in a lot of contexts, that, you know, we have our springs and our summers of intense action, and we have our falls of harvesting, and then we have our winters where we're stepping back and hibernating and reflecting and preparing. And in those moments, that documentation of history that Laura was talking about becomes so essential, because we need to learn from each other's stories, and we need to learn from the ways in which this all fits together, the analysis that organizers and activists can offer us in kind of stringing together, like, what's going on in Chicago, what's going on in Atlanta. Like, our media organizations are providing a place for all of those connections to happen, and for that to fuel movements, particularly in those winter seasons.
That's such a beautiful way to put it. Thank you. Yeah, there's something that happens when I'm on break. I'm famously really, really bad at taking time off, I presume. Caitlin, our publisher, can attest to that. And one of the reasons for why I struggle with it is that I constantly need to be in movement, journalism wise. I feel like if we're not, if there is something happening and news wise, like not being able to report on it, not being able to like pitch out a piece, not being able to like work on a project, I stall. I kind of break down because it's my purpose. It's the thing that moves me ultimately. And I think that's one of the most difficult things for many of us, is that these aren't just jobs that we do and then we just like clock out and like we're fine. This is part of who we are. And this question wasn't something that I added to our rundown. How are you able to take moments of rest? How are you able to like sit back and maybe even relax a little bit when you are so driven by these moments, because they're part of who you are, they are part of our communities? I'd love each of you to answer this because I think it would be useful for folks as they consume a lot of news these days.
I was laughing because my partner's in the other room and often wondering when I'm gonna take a break. I mean, in the past couple of years, I've taken a break when I've reached a breaking point, you know, of just like of exhaustion, essentially, and that's definitely not the way to do it. I just unmuted because nobody else did. I don't actually have a good answer.
It's fine.
No. The one decent answer I have is that I have found that when I am part of a good organization, when I'm in organizing and primarily grounded there rather than primarily grounded in the news cycle, it's a significantly easier for me to orient myself to the long term, because I have, you know, this community organizing group or whatever it is, mutual aid group that I want to last, and I want, and if I'm talking to other people in the group about not burning out, you know, you're somewhat compelled to take your own advice. And so being grounded there is the antidote for me, because totally stepping back is very difficult for more than a short period of time, and maybe less effective. I do want to be a part of this long term, so I don't just want to step back. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a media literacy question. We don't have anything in the Q&A, so I'm just going to keep rolling with the additional questions that I had. What are some of the most reliable media literacy tools that readers should pack away in their minds for when they're consuming news media? So like tips and tricks and things that you're aware of, but that you would love for readers to be aware of. Who would like to go first?
I can go. I made a little list of just like random thoughts before this call, and I feel like maybe I should just put them because they tend to be, they're a little more concrete than some of the things I was saying earlier. But I was reminded, especially by Maya's earlier comments about access journalism. So things to watch out for, especially in election season and in the fog of, you know, geopolitical upheaval and things like that. One thing that our readers should be aware exists is the idea of like trial balloons, which you may or may not be aware of. This is a thing where politicians deliberately leak a story to the press because they don't necessarily want to attach to their name yet until they can monitor the public reaction, right? So they leak it and then sort of test the wind and see how it goes. Oftentimes it's a negative policy proposal just to see how bad is the public reaction to this, right? And sometimes it's dramatized deliberately, right? That like it's going to be that it's worse than it would actually be in the proposal, so that if the government decides to ultimately move forward with that proposal, people are expecting the worst already, and it won't seem like as big a deal. So, for example, if they're saying, you know, there's an anonymous leak in the press that, you know, there's going to be 10,000 troops sent out or whatever, and then it ultimately ends up being like 500. People are like, oh, not so bad. You were being dramatic, right? So that kind of thing is something to be aware of. Sanction leaking, right? This is something I think Joshua was alluding to before. Always ask, like, who would have leaked this? Who benefits from this being out there, right? We have to have critical thinking around those things. And that's part of this broader phenomenon of access journalism, where journalists are trying to cultivate positive relationships with well-positioned sources so that they can keep getting those tips and they can keep getting those exclusive stories. And it's part of the reason that we see so many softball interviews that are very frustrating to watch, right? With politicians and elite figures, because journalists don't want to jeopardize future opportunities to get interviews either with that individual or somebody from their team or like their party more broadly, or the institutions that they represent, right? So you may see reporters failing to press their interviewees on like evasive answers, or, you know, avoiding controversial questions. Sometimes they're even asking pre-approved questions, allowing the source to vet it, which is not really ethical in journalism, right? In the worst cases, they may be even allowing the interviewee to sort of have some level of control over what that published product or broadcasted report looks like, which again is really a no-no in like ethical journalism. We also see the emergence of something called of access journalism based investigations. So traditionally, investigative journalism is very much focused on accountability. That's really crucial to our democracy, right? And traditionally, that investigative reporting is based on like leaks or whistleblowers who are exposing wrongdoing within a government agency, right? Or something dubious happening within that agency. Now we're seeing the emergence of something where people are reporting on leaks from within governments and security agencies. You know, they're using unnamed sources. They're not really giving the public the evidence that they need to really corroborate and understand what's happening. And there's little to no transparency around there. And typically it's serving the agenda of the government. So we have to be critical around these like quick hit access investigations, right? Which are positioned as like exclusives. But think about like, where did this come from, right? And then one more thing I wanted to mention is vague headlines, right? This is just something I see and again. Like, I mean, obviously anyone who reads the New York Times knows that it's just a joke now, right? Clashes, tensions, conflict, right? It's like, what does that even mean, right? So if you just do a compare and contrast between a lot of the reporting that's coming out of the student press right now, covering these protests and encampments around the country versus how the Times or CNN is covering it, I mean, you can see a clear difference. One of these parties is willing to call a spade and the other is not, right? So you can make your choice about what you want to read based on that. I also would suggest it's not paranoia to dig into the writer and their sources. If something feels off to you, you can look them up. It's not weird. I mean, we have documentation of the links between writers' own personal interests and the reporting that they produce, right? So who wrote this? Do they have a spouse who works in the defense industry? That's a valid question to ask. Do they have a child who serves in the IDF? that's a very common thing actually at the Times and other publications, right? And these are the same kind of questions that you ask of your politicians and your elected officials, and journalists should be held to the same standards. And then let's see, regurgitation is another thing that I see a lot, where there's a massive bias in our industry towards regurgitation of what's already been documented, because people are uncomfortable being the first to say something, or they don't want to like get called out for reporting something or using certain language that they think is a little iffy or questionable or they're not sure about. So obviously, yes, as journalists, we are citing our sources whenever possible, but oftentimes we see this turns into an over-reliance on other reporting as a crutch, just to make their editor or reporter feel more comfortable using this. Like, okay, CNN has written about this, we're good then, right? So just as an example, I know a reporter at a local news outlet. It's like a big name outlet. And when they were pitching stories relating to local advocacy for a ceasefire resolution, the editor was like, "Oh yeah, we're not covering that," and was really denigrating this as just like, "Oh, this is just something happening at the university. It's just like students, right?" And then later, when things began to escalate just in the past month and a half, and ceasefire resolution became like the #1 thing that was being brought before the city council week after week, and now campus protests are dominating the national conversation, the editors were like, okay, we'll greenlight a story about these protests. But then as that story came forward, they really were like nitpicking at every single word and assertion that the reporter made. They were asking like, do you have a link for this? Like, has that been reported already? But the reporter could not link to it because they hadn't been allowed to write a story about this before. So that existing documentation and coverage didn't exist. So yes, there's a lot of talk about media rushing to be the first and making mistakes and doing that, but we also see the opposite is true when they don't want to be the first to report something because that goes against the status quo, and they don't want to get into hot water until everyone else is doing it, and then it's okay. So just some thoughts for things that I've been seeing and that have been bothering me and that might be helpful to have in their back pocket.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a very complete toolkit. I feel like the only one that I'd add is combing through the sources of the piece, how many sources there were and who they were. And yeah, and just tracking those, because that can be very illuminating too. There's something in the chat. I've had conversations with people who clearly have been influenced by mainstream media narratives. How do we reach younger readers and start planting these critical seed of media literacy with high school students, college students, etc.? I'll start off this question quickly, and then I'd like to pass it off to Maya, and then we can close out since we're at the top of the hour. Prism has started working with quite a few student journalists. So one of the key things is actually like have your reporters actually be the students, have it be the peers of the people that you're trying to reach, because the people that they're going to trust are going to be the people that are in their circles, in their communities. And it's, it can be like slow going at first for outlets, but once you have a few really great student reporters or like youth reporters, there's the like little butterfly effect or the ripple effect of like, you start to build a network and a community of like student sources, student journalists, their own communities, their homes that start to connect and build trusting relationships with an outlet and the communities that they're reporting from. So that's one of the suggestions that I wanted to put out there. Maya, did you have any suggestions, or Joshua, did you have any?
Absolutely. I think this question is really important. And Laura, I love that, like actually cultivating youth reporters, actually making it clear to people that they can make media, I think is a really, really crucial tool of movement journalism that we hadn't really talked about yet, but that I kind of see as essential, that we are all making media all the time. We're all sharing, we're all talking to each other, we're all texting, we're making media all the time. And recognizing that, I think can kind of force some questions that are really useful in starting to develop media literacy as part of our daily lives. I would also say that the key to media literacy is asking questions. And right now, there's a lot of kind of corporate tools and courses that are trying to kind of produce media literacy, like curricula that you can buy and like little services that you can pay for that are actually just like pointing people toward corporate sources and pointing people toward, fly on the wall, like objective journalism principles. And I think instead of that, thinking about this question of like why and who and like how how these stories are happening, why they're happening, and who put them there, those are things that I think young people want to know anyway. And I think that all of us want to know them anyway, but just thinking about like as you're figuring out the world, that those questions actually drive you in a lot of ways and should also drive news reading and consumption. So that feels important. And then the other thing I would say, and this is like super obvious, but it's one of our central frustrations at Truth Out, is encouraging people to read beyond the headline. Essential. So many people do not read the article. They read the headline, they retweet or they reshare. And, it's not a youth only thing. Adults do that. We see that across the age spectrum with readers. But I think it's one of the most basic and essential media literacy tools is like just reading, and it's also something that gets you to that second part, because obviously you read it and you could be like, this is bullshit, but you need to read it to know and to ask the questions that are going to get you actually engaged in the conversation.
Thank you. Any closing thoughts as we peter out?
One thing I would say is if you were like me, very young, 20 years ago, when the US was rushing into, a disastrous, illegitimate war with Iraq, I think it's worth it to spend some time going back and studying what happened then and how the media was complicit then. And then you'll look at everything you read with a new lens.
Thank you so much. Thank you to each. Yeah, it's 5:04 over here, so I'm gonna close it out so our audience can leave. I recommend to each of our audience members to head over to Analyst News and Truth Out. And Josh, we can find you on Twitter and Instagram, right? What was your handle?
Yeah, it's just Joshua P. Hill. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all of your time. Happy May Day. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And we will let you know when this recording is live.